and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, April 18th, 2024, the committee is commencing its study of state of airline competition in Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures. To prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries, all in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from the microphone at all times. As indicated in the communique from the speaker to all members on Monday, April 29th, all earpieces must be replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please only use the black-approved earpieces. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you are not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for the purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Also, colleagues, the room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. Thank you all for your understanding and your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses. I'd also like to inform you that the committee, that all witnesses have completed their required connection tests in advance of this meeting and have passed those tests. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. Appearing as an individual, we have Mr. John Graddick, faculty lecturer and program coordinator, Aviation Leadership, School of Continuing Studies at my alma mater, McGill University, joining us by video conference. Welcome to you, sir. As an individual, we have Mr. Carl Moore, associate professor, also from McGill University. Welcome to you, sir. À titre personnel, nous avons professeur Jacques Roy de HEC.
As an individual, we have Mr. Jacques Roy, full professor, HEC Montreal. Welcome. And we also have from Université du Québec à Montréal, the International Aeronautics Civil and Civil Aviation Observatory, Mr. Mehran Ebrahimi, director and professor. Welcome, sir.
I will turn the floor over to Mr. Graddick. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transportation Infrastructure and Communities for extending the invitation to myself and my fellow colleagues in academia to speak to you today on the state of airline competition in Canada. My comments on the subject come to close to 50 years of either working in the bowels of the industry to teaching managers around the world the do's and don'ts of how to best achieve respectable financial and operating performance in the industry. So it might be said that I've observed the highs and lows of Canada's evolution with deregulation, starting in 1985 with our infamous Freedom to Move white paper, 1987 National Transportation Act, privatizing Air Canada, and many more. And of course, the evolution of many commercial air carriers in Canada. The state of airline competition in Canada has evolved significantly in recent times, exemplified in the eyes of the Canadian air traveler by the reduction and the operations of numerous operators that have branded themselves as either low-cost or ultra-low-cost carriers. And is that a measure of, activity, really the right proxy that we should be using to determine whether we are a hot spot for for aviation competition or not? And I asked that question rhetorically in a recent article in the Hill Times, where I said, is there a crisis in the Canadian aviation and the Canadian civil aviation? The answer should be no, there is no crisis. But the industry is just going through what has been characterized as its usual bumps in the road, bumps in airline evolution. Carriers have been launching themselves with great fanfare, lower airfares, introduced to the glee of Canadian air travelers, great expectations being created for expansion to bring air service and lower fares, both primary and secondary markets, and even greater benefits of multiple new carriers with similar strategies were launched. Great news for Canadians who are, by nature, lovers of low airfares. However bright the honeymoon phase, and within relatively short order, the competitive realities of Canadian commercial operations affect the financial viability of these Canadian upstarts. The number of Canadian air travel markets in which these operators traditionally operate have been the same where Canada's established duopolies operate. So very few new Canadian metro centers have had the benefit of this increased competition. We have very few metro centers in Canada that have multiple airports that have the ability to support multiple carriers trying to build frequencies. So new carriers have built up presence on top of existing services, and price competition could only limit competitive response for so long. As traditional carriers reacted to this competition and reduced fares along the way, new carriers needed to reduce fares consistently to maintain their competitive gap. And the race to the bottom is on. And we all know how this story ends. And it's ended there time and time again since the early 1990s. While the federal government of the late Honorable Brian Mulroney and the tenure of the late Honorable Don Mazankowski had great ideals for the evolution of the Canadian airline industry as enshrined in the National Transportation Act for many years, were in competition and market forces both within and among the various modes of transportation are the prime agents in providing viable and effective transportation services. Unfortunately, the paucity of domestic air travel markets has made these ideals very difficult to attain. Canadian air travelers need a better set of measures of effectiveness when it comes to evaluating the state of airline competition in Canada. And that starts off with a better set of attainable, realistic, and viable opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Graddick. Prochainement, nous irons avec Monsieur Roy. Monsieur Roy.
Then we'll turn over to Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, over to you for 5 minutes, please. Hello, and thank you to all committee members for giving me the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on the state of airline competition in Canada. I agree with John, and I'll step out of my statement because I don't think 5 minutes will be enough. As professors, we're used to more or less 3 hours. So very quickly, the 3 topics that I want to discuss is the Canadian local market, and I'll talk about regional transportation, and also speak about airports, which is one of my best topics. So talking about the Canadian local transportation market, and as long as I can remember, we've always had the presence of Air Canada with a second carrier in the West for very long. It was Canadian International, which merged with Air Canada. This was a bit they were a bit strange bedfellows in the beginning. And then this opened the opportunity for WestJet in 96, was a low-cost carrier. And then they experienced a significant growth. And they moved from 6% of return on investment to about 46%. And this caught the interest of many other players who said, well, this would be interesting. I should also become a low-cost carrier. And that is how other players jumped on the market. And well, unfortunately, some had a short-lived stint on the market. So everyone tried to get a share of this low-cost market. And then finally, we realized that even WestJet understood that this model had its own shortcomings, because we have only a few cities in Canada able to sustain the presence of a carrier, a low-cost carrier with 737 Boeing carriers. So this market makes it such that this Southwest model with point-to-point service and low-cost transportation is difficult to replicate. And in order to develop, WestJet had to open up and to seek out international markets and finally distance itself from the successful conditions experienced by low-cost carriers. So yes, today we have new players coming in, but they're experiencing a number of challenges. Among other things, high cost. And then we have Porter, which has a certain market share. Air Canada has maintained its dominant position today. WestJet has lost about 10% of the market to the benefit of other carriers. Regionally, very quickly, a more difficult situation because a small number of travelers makes it such that the carriers would use smaller planes, which implies higher cost per seat, and sometimes they even have challenges of filling up all those seats. And this makes it such that globally the costs are much more high. And across the world, countries are beginning to experience this challenge and have come up with support programs across the US and Europe. In Canada, unfortunately, we don't have those programs. During the pandemic, some of those programs came up, and in Quebec, the provincial government decided to adopt an aid program to assist travelers from regions in order to subsidize the cost of air travel to a certain percentage of the cost of the air ticket. And these subsidized tickets were equally targeting tourists and people from local areas moving to the main cities. Now, I'll close with airports because sometimes we really hope that American low-cost carriers should come and inject a bit more of competition and allow our travelers to be able to move from one point to the other or to travel from Canada to the US. But sometimes what we learn is that these carriers are a bit reticent to come to Canada as a result of all the taxes and high costs airport duties. And I think it's high time for the provincial governments, and I'm addressing committee members, that it's high time we look at the governance of airports because we're realizing that the airport duties keep rising. By the day, the cost of infrastructure as well as projects are significant, and there are more investments on the way. And I think government should take a look at its intervention model. And I think we've allowed too much leg room to airport administrations, and it's high time we looked at the mandate of those entities. And if you want details, there's many of such details in my last publication. And of course, it'd be my pleasure to address all your questions. I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roy. Up next is Professor Ibrahimi. Over to you for 5 minutes, please. Hello, dear committee members. Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel meeting. I mean, I completely endorse what my colleagues before me mentioned. And I'd like to say that at the observatory, we try to study the Canadian context, as well as we try to compare that with the international context, and we're constantly doing that in order to see how our systems are evolving compared to those on the international scene. It is in this light that I'm intervening here. So what I can say is that the issue of competition in Canada is never raised in the same way as elsewhere. For instance, if I look at our neighbors to the south in the US or our friends over in Europe for different reasons, the first reason being the distance for an airline company in Europe that could travel from Paris to Barcelona with 4 or 5 rotations a day. The distances across Canada do not allow that amount of rotation between Montreal and Vancouver on a daily basis. And this becomes a limitation, a natural limitation. Also, there's issues of climate issues. We have a climate that makes operability of airline carriers as well as our infrastructure a bit, it's a different specificity, and my colleague Jacques Roy mentioned it in a very relevant manner. The population density, we don't have the population density as elsewhere to allow for us to be able to have a significant volume of travel. Another aspect, which is more sociological, is the culture of air travel is less present here in Canada than in America or in Europe. we should add to this that issues of taxes and levies, which were mentioned from the outset, I think you need about $150 to start in terms of airport duties or airport taxes. And this makes it such that from the outset, it already affects the pricing. We should bear all of this in mind, that the notion of competition across Canada should be is unique in that sense. The other specificity with us is the lack of coherence in a certain way. Today, one of the aspects that plays a key role, in addition to what my colleagues mentioned, is the availability of different travel routes, and this makes it such that different companies have their own schedules. The smaller players are affected by this. They're not able to open new routes, and we shouldn't forget that two important airports in Canada, Montreal and Pearson, will be committing to significant infrastructure construction projects in the next 10 years, which will significantly affect the volume of air travel. And this will affect the concentration of air travel with these heavy carriers. The other aspect that we can raise, and maybe we can come back to this later, is the role played by airline companies or carriers. But also we need to add to our brainstorming process the issue of infrastructure. We have, like my colleague mentioned, Professor Roy, there's an issue with regard to consistency and the governance of our airports. And this raises a major issue. We are not investing enough in airline or airport infrastructure. So this, if we take the case of the pandemic, for instance, in the early weeks of the pandemic, the American government intervened by offering significant amounts of subsidies to airline companies and made significant investments to the tune of $50 to $60 billion. The other thing that we did during the same period is that, first of all, we imposed on our airports to remain open, and for long, we had a cut in revenues, significant cuts in revenues, and even airports which were in the green found themselves in debt. So when we look at the investment levels of the Canadian government in its airports, this doesn't exceed, we could look at specific numbers, but it's not in excess of $500 million, which makes it such that the different instruments, as well as the key aspects of competition that can lead to healthy competition, are absent, and that lack of consistency, that's what makes it difficult for us to be able, for the sector to be able to compete. And this makes it even much more difficult for smaller carriers to be able to get into the market. Hence, competition becomes quite problematic. Thank you. I'll stop here.
And concluding our opening remarks today, we have Professor Moore. Professor Moore, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Ottawa. You don't say, people from Montreal generally don't say that, but it's the center of the world for the Canadian Parliament and system. So it's part of the experience economy to be here. My background, grew up in Toronto, but taught at Oxford for many years. And about 28 years ago, started working with British Airways and also with Lufthansa. Done many courses with IATA, which is the International Airline Transport Association, headquartered in Geneva and in Montreal. So I've done a lot of work with foreign airlines. So I bring that perspective, which I know my colleagues have as well. And Canada is a different place. It is unusual in a couple different ways. It's a different place in terms of the size of the country and a small population and winter. You're Canadian parliamentarians. This is not a surprise. We have winter. You're in Ottawa. So it's something where these are making huge differences. Now, you might say Australia and Chile have big countries with small populations. We have it harder than they do. And one of the things that we really do have a problem with is the government taxes and regulation. We'll get back to that in a minute. So we have three big cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver from a population viewpoint. And forgive my brother's family in Calgary. I apologize to them. But we have three big, and Vancouver is not only the size, but connecting us with Asia. So these are huge issues we have to wrestle with. We're different. We also have a lot of foreign airlines who fly to Canada. From Europe, you think of British Airways, Lufthansa, that fly to Montreal and Toronto and other places across the country. We have the U.S. airlines, Delta Airlines, international parts ran by Alan Belmar and McGill Grad, a Canadian used to run Bombardier. Huge number of flights come into our major cities from the U.S. So we have much competition, more than we might realize on the surface. COVID happened, worst time in aviation history, which seems like an overstatement, but it really only started at the Wright brothers flying, so it's not going back to the Roman Empire. So it's something where it's the worst time. We did not support airlines very well in Canada compared to the US and into Europe. I remember visiting WestJet. I don't know if it's still true, but out there they had 6 panels, 6 plaques of airlines that have gone bankrupt in Canada. They did that to keep WestJet employees aware of the history here in Canada is terrible for airlines. And a big part of that, some of it goes to Air Canada's dominance. And now WestJet, but we also have Porter with fairly deep pockets with a lot of interesting new planes. They had the great asset of the Island Airport. I flew there last week because I wanted to be in the heart of Toronto. And you're at the island. You take a sidewalk, a moving sidewalk, you take a free shuttle on cheap, and you're there. It's great. But they're now flying at a Pearson was the size of the planes are too big for the Island Airport. So Porter is quite a good one as well. The biggest problem here are taxes. I took 48 McGill students to Morocco and Cairo in March. Getting prices right now to go to Kenya next year. I saw $1,458 plus taxes made it $2,340. It went from we could afford it, we could not, because of hundreds of dollars of taxes. There's a little support for airports here in Canada. I have a national radio show. I interview CEOs. So I've interviewed the last 4 CEOs of WestJet, the last 4 CEOs of Air Canada, the CEO of Air France twice, KLM, and so on. Talked to many, many executives in the industry. There's little support for airports in Canada. This is the government's, Ottawa's, fault or approach, if you would, to back off a little bit. And the government can improve this dramatically. So I have 3 key takeaways. We have geography, and it's different than the rest of the world. We got to be aware of that, which we are. We're Canadians. We have huge taxes and fees. Beyond, and one of my neighbors works for IATA. I've done a lot of work with them. We could not find a country in the world of any size, that has the kind of burden we have. We may have missed one. But when we look at the US and the EU and Australia, the places we look, they're not remotely at the same level. We need LCCs, but how do they survive with all the fees the government places on them? So do we need more competition? Yes. What we need less is burdensome taxes, airport fees, et cetera, from, broadly speaking, not to blame you, the government. So I end with 5 seconds less. I feel excessively proud of myself.
Thank you very much, Professor Moore. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for their testimony. I want to go back to Professor Moore. He managed his time very well, but I wonder if he has more to say about what we just heard, that the Canadian traveler bears the highest taxes and fees in the world when it comes to our airfares. We saw that in the last budget, the government increased the security charge. I believe that comes into effect tomorrow, where our security charges will go up to more than twice what is paid for an international flight out of the United States. So I guess my question is, what's the low-hanging fruit? What are the taxes and fees that the government can look to reduce or bring into line with our international competitors right off the hop? Are we talking about do we need to fundamentally alter the way that our airports run, or are there ways to look at reducing fees that will immediately benefit passengers who are looking for lower airfares?
I think the airports, for their faults, are well run. I sit down with the CEOs every couple of years, and they're spending a lot of money in Pearson and at Trudeau Airport to improve them, and they need that to do that. I think it's a matter of just reducing the fees and the government taking on the responsibility that most governments around the world do towards funding the industry, funding airports particularly. I don't know if my colleagues have any comments to add to that, if I might be so bold.
Yeah, thank you. I did want to talk to Professor Ibrahimi. Sorry, you talked about taxes and levies being $150 to start to get out of the gate before you've stepped onto the aircraft. You're into a ticket, or the airline's into a ticket for $150. How can an ultra low cost or even a low cost carrier be expected to compete in a marketplace where a round trip ticket is $300, even for, say, between Calgary and Abbotsford, or short, 1,000-kilometer distance like that? How could we ever have more competition when the taxes and fees almost or double or triple the advertised prices that some of these low cost carriers have?
Vous avez tout à fait raison, Monsieur le député.
You're right, sir. This is really a major challenge. For the taxes, we could even say we would maybe tax the users and payers, which is a bit the philosophy here in Canada, which is a really terrible philosophy. And if we were to tax airline companies and passengers in order to have the necessary infrastructure, well, worst case scenario, I'd say it's for a good cause, but that is not even the case. So if I look at the case of Montreal Trudeau, it's about $140 to $150 million, about 12% of its revenue that goes to the federal government. So to come back to your question, the principle in itself, when we look at competition elsewhere in other countries, it is not. These are not conventional companies competing against themselves. It is local companies, notably really low-cost companies that are acting on the market. So their main argument is that they want to offer interesting or attractive prices. So if, for instance, you start with $150 and more, it makes it such that the price that you will offer will be more than that amount, and that amount will keep increasing, as you mentioned yourself. So in a certain way, we are kind of, already hamstringing those companies from the outset, and we cannot, by so doing, give birth to other local players. And I think we can reduce these costs, but at some point, really, these taxes are quite a burden and major obstacle in the way of low-cost carriers. And I don't know that with this current situation, we can witness the emergence of low-cost carriers in our country.
Thank you. I have limited time left. So, Professor Waugh, you stated in a news article that if you want to become a millionaire, you should start as a billionaire and then buy an airline. And I wanted to talk a bit about, you and others mentioned the need for deep pockets. Do you think that the foreign ownership restrictions that are in place in Canada, should that be looked at all to allow for deep pockets from around the world to perhaps help out low-cost carriers or new entrants into the Canadian market, or should we maintain our current foreign ownership restrictions?
Oui, merci pour la question.
Thank you very much for your question. There are many challenges regarding these limitations on foreign participation in our airline transportation system. In my view, it's not necessary to lift those restrictions. There are enough rich people with deep pockets in Canada.
invest in airlines. So I don't think we need to open up this constraint. Mais parce que ça a aussi toutes sortes d'implications au niveau.
Also, because that leads to different implications in terms of bilateral agreements, and if we were to do that, our partners from America and other countries, are they going to reciprocate? So, and to come back very quickly to the issue of taxes and duties, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here to say that all carriers have to pay their taxes. So that way you're able to have a level playing field. And yes, the taxes are high, but at the same time, it's a bit rather normal that users should pay the real cost of the services that they are getting in return. Well, yes, I'll stop here then. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses today. It's great to have you here with all your experience and knowledge on some of the topics we're discussing in terms of competition. Professor Moore, you talked about how Canada's a large country with, large geography where we have terrible weather at times and impacts airlines, and we saw some of that a couple of winters ago. But the biggest piece that I see is flying from Newfoundland and Labrador to Ottawa on a regular basis is the challenge of getting into rural and remote areas, and not exactly totally remote, but very rural, like Atlantic Canada, for instance. Most of the flights for me for the past couple of years have been 3 segments: Ottawa to Montreal or Toronto, then to Halifax, then to Gander. So it's basically a full day of travel by the time you arrive. The problem with that is that it's only one airline that's going in there, and that's Air Canada. We're now subletting to Provincial Airlines. There's no WestJet, there's no Porter, there's no Sunwing, only on just a seasonal basis, charter flights or something along those lines. So, there used to be a time when you could get into Gander at 2 or 3 or 4 different times a day, but not anymore. So I just want to ask this question. Have you seen competition, the competition trend for regional airlines and smaller airports in Canada over the past few years and even a few decades? Has that declined or it's very different from what it used to be?
I think you're right, Mr. Rogers. There's 2 trends. One is that one way of saving money is fly out of second-tier airports. And so my brother lives in Abbotsford, and I remember flying out there to Calgary, then on to Montreal. And it was great because they said, "Hi, Gary," to my brother. He still had to go through security, but the guard knew him. And there was 3 gates or something. Like, it was a lot less expensive, a lot more accessible. And it was great if you live on kind of the east side of Vancouver. It actually saved you lots of parking and time. So that's one element, and that's one way we can save money, but you need to have, and you wouldn't have second-tier airports so much in the Maritimes. You do Montreal, Toronto, that sort of thing, but you don't there. And we've seen a decline. Part of it is the airlines are businesses. I'm a business professor, forgive me. The idea is to make money. Now, you can make excessive amounts of money, but given what happened in COVID and the lack of support compared to other countries, they've had huge financial issues to deal with, and they're going to fly where the money is to a considerable degree. Now, that means it's going to be more expensive to fly to some parts of the world. Like I flew recently to the Yukon, and it was very expensive because of the lack of demand. So part of it is the reality of what is the demand. WestJet has pulled back under their new CEO to a certain degree from Eastern Canada to focus more in the West. He's an ex-senior executive from Lufthansa, knows Europe, and
So
he has a competitive approach.
So that destroyed the competition factor in Atlantic Canada.
Well, part of it is
which has
that,
led to
yes,
some very high prices. Flying from Halifax to Gander and return costing more than $1,000 on a return trip. It's way above where it used to be. And,
if there is
and that's
demand, sir.
lack of competition. People complain in our region.
Yeah.
Competition is needed, desperately needed, to force Air Canada to drop the prices.
If the demand is there, in our system, competitors will come along to make money and become rich. This is how the system works. So there's some things happening which are unusual dynamics there. Otherwise, some of the competitors in Canada would be there to service that market. Partly it's the distance from their home base and some issues like that. But the system largely works in much of the world. It's a lack of demand, a lack of support, and part of it's the sheer distances, getting pilots and planes there. There's some physical things as well, sir.
Professor Granick, I just want to ask, in your research and your work you've done, is there a region, I guess anywhere globally, that you believe that competition and regional connectivity is higher or of better quality than we have here in Canada?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that the world is having a problem serving regional markets that have insufficient densities. As Professor Moore has mentioned, if you haven't got the traveling public there to support an essential service, you're not going to get direct service. So I think that there is no region in the world that has a characteristic that we should model. The U.S. has what we call the Essential Air Services Act. That is part of their mentality. They've identified a couple of hundred city pairs in the U.S. that the U.S. government is in fact subsidizing air service. That doesn't exist in Canada. So that is an opportunity for us, if we want to go down that path, to look at identifying which city pairs should be considered as requiring essential air services and act accordingly.
So, Mr. Ibrahimi, what are some of the barriers that you see towards achieving more competition, and not just excuses from airlines or innovation and technology and all these investment goals? What are some things that you think could be removed and improve competition?
30 secondes, s'il vous plaît. Vous êtes en sourdine, professeur.
Your mic is muted. Sorry. Okay, thank you for your question. So the first thing, I'd like to come back to the absence of consistency. So, we've been saying for a couple of years now that there's not a competition. There's no competition, but on the other hand, we refuse mergers. So we did not want Sunwing to be acquired by WestJet. So that means that we're giving WestJet 52% of all Sun travel in Canada and 72% in Western Canada. So we've concentrated, so we agreed to that. Sorry, we didn't refuse that merger, we agreed to it. And then a few years ago, because of COVID, the situation changed. We had agreed that Air Transit be acquired by Air Canada. So the Competition Bureau accepted that, but it would have had to been, so there's an inconsistency and that we're not aware of. And that's an obstacle that's important, I think. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahimi. Mr. Barcelu-Duval, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses that are here with us today. I would like to maybe continue on what Mr. Rogers had started and with Mr. Ibrahimi. So the idea of the existence of big players. I'm glad that there are big companies that can operate from here to serve international markets. So whether we're talking about WestJet or Air Canada. But I wonder if at one point in time, there's a limit that's reached or a threshold that, so for example, and I don't have the exact figures with me, but if I'm correct, in Montreal, it's about 60% of Dorval's traffic that comes from Air Canada. So if I go to the grocery store and if I have 60% of goods that are from the same company, is that healthy for a market? So would it not be better to put restrictions on the number of time slots or a number of gates used? I don't know, maybe Mr. Roy, maybe you could talk to us a bit more about that. Thank you. Listen, I don't think that we need to limit the activities of Air Canada. It's our main carrier. It's our standard bearer, if you will. Traditionally, Air Canada has always been dominant, and it has over 50% of the market today. Yes, it's very present in the Montreal Trudeau area, but that hasn't always been the case. Transat in the past had more destinations internationally than Air Canada. So there is already competition at the international level. That's not really what worries me. Mr. Ibrahimi, what would you say to that? Well, I think to continue to build on what Mr. Roy has said, it's not a good idea to weaken the national company. In all countries, the national company has a significant presence. But the question is, beside that, what do we do so to foster competition and that other companies can exist? So in Canada, we don't have a national strategy with regard to everything that's air transit. And because we don't have that strategy, we improvise. So we take money, we collect money from the air companies, from passengers and from airports, and that money does not go back into the aviation economy to try to improve the infrastructure. So as my colleague John said, we could develop this further so that in Canada we have measures that we could reserve a certain number of time slots for small companies. We could develop this idea of taxation. The idea of taxation is a very important question, and that's something that the government has control over. We can choose regions in Canada where we intervene, and this has been done in many countries, like Norway, for example. So you choose regions that you consider important, where air transportation is an important economic lever, and you try to support that. But the idea of weakening the national company will not necessarily help other, it's the taxation system. Doing that won't help won't help competition. So I think we have to look at everything coherently and consistently, and we have to come up with a national strategy. And I'll end on that. We're almost the only country with interesting with interesting companies and expertise that doesn't have a national strategy with regard to this sector. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. Maybe not the idea of limiting, but what threshold? How do we judge if a company has too much weight or a monopoly? So at what point does that become bad for competition? Is it 70%, 75%, 80, 85, 90? Is there a number, or is there no limit at all? Mr. Ibrahimi, and then maybe Mr. Roy after. Well, I think, if you look at British Airways, in Heathrow or Lufthansa in Frankfurt or there are companies that are very big. But the question that you're asking is, I don't think there's a threshold. The idea is, what's important is the extent. So in Montreal, Trudeau, 50% of activity is Air Canada based. So the problem, though, is it's not the 50% that's a problem. If you go to Heathrow, British Airways has more percentage than that. But how can we foster the conditions so that low-cost carriers can emerge? So when the taxes are too high, when there are climate conditions and distances that are too big or very big, when there's a labor shortage, those are all factors. It's those questions that become determining, not necessarily the percentage of, that the national company has at a given airport. And I think those are the questions, and we can intervene there. I think those are the areas that we're neglecting. And I'm not sure of the percentages. I don't know if Jacques Roy might have, he's more of a specialist in this area, but I don't think that there is a percentage. Thank you, Mr. Barcelo-Duval.
The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and engaging with us on this topic. I wanted to take it in a little bit different direction. Now, we're talking about competition in the air sector and how to, ostensibly part of the conversation is how to resolve this issue of new entrants to the market having trouble competing with the big airlines. We've heard about taxes and fees, and yet I think Mr. Waugh made the good point that if you lower the bar for everyone, you're not creating a competitive advantage for smaller airlines. You're just making air travel cheaper. And of course, someone is going to have to pick up those costs. Certainly, we hear the idea floated that Canada should be subsidizing airports publicly in a greater way. And what I wanted to ask about is the larger public policy objective when it comes to passenger transportation, because what we're talking about isn't how to make flying cheaper. We're talking about how to move people. And that's something I think that is a very worthy policy objective that we need to think about more broadly. Only about half of Canadians fly regularly, or at least those are the last numbers I've seen, maybe from several years ago. Perhaps more people are flying now, but there's a significant portion of the population that doesn't fly. We're a country that has no bus system. So one of the least expensive ways to move people around a big country is by bus, and yet we have nothing, like virtually nothing, connecting our country since Greyhound pulled out. Our passenger rail system is a shadow of what other countries are capable of doing. So my question is, when we talk about scarce public finances, where do we invest those finances in a way that has the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people when it comes to transportation? And is the way that the direction we should be looking, investing public subsidies in airports so that we can get more people flying more cheaply? Is that the primary public policy objectives that we should be considering in this conversation? And I'm happy to direct that to whomever, perhaps starting with Mr. Graddick, and then we can go to Mr. Moore here in person.
Thank you, Mr. Bacharach. I think that you've touched the nail on the head in terms of where is it that we as a Canadian people ought to be putting our dollars and cents in trying to support transportation in this country. The railways built this country 130 years ago, 140 years ago, and I think that we've evolved the Canadian air transportation system over the last 110 years to the point where I now consider that Canadians feel that air travel is an essential Canadian human right, that we need air travel in order for this country to survive, that without air travel, that, how do you get, to Vancouver from Toronto or Ottawa? And there is no viable alternative that's really competitive to what's going on around us in the world. So essential air, services air is really an integral part of making our economy work. Now, the question becomes one of who pays for it. And so we've made a decision over the last 20 years as Canadians, 25 years, to basically say user pay, that those people who use air services should be paying for air services. And that's the model that's created all of these taxes that my colleagues and I have been talking about over the years in terms of a barrier to entry for many, many carriers into Canada. But that's a fundamental question. User pay means that only air passengers should be paying for the infrastructure required to support air services. Unfortunately, that model, while it served its day back in the mid-90s, early 2000s, I think that the world has changed. That the world is now looking at air services, airport infrastructure, the whole of airports as being, an economic weight that has to be borne by the country themselves. So when I look at investments in airports around the world, I see, Saudi Arabia, I see the United Arab Emirates investing $35-40 billion, into airports, because they know that the future of their country, the future of their economy, is really based on airports. And if there's one country that is really focusing on airports as a key infrastructure, it should be Canada. So to me, I believe you're right. Canadians, we have to change the model. The user pay model doesn't work anymore.
Thank you, Professor Graddick, and thank you very much, Mr. Bacharach. Next, we have Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, welcome to Transport Committee. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your line of questioning, sir.
Thank you very much, and very nice to be here in Transport Committee and to talk about competition in our airline sector. And yes, we have a major problem in competition. We have a duopoly, which is controlling over 80% of flights in Canada, and happy to participate on some of the questions with witnesses here. And how do we fix this competition problem we have with airlines? To give perspective, Canada had 85 million domestic travelers in 2019. So on the year that we could track before COVID, we compared to Australia. Australia only had 63 million. So we have significant amount of travelers domestically. If we include domestic and international travel, Canada had 166 million passengers on Canadian Airlines. So Canadian Airlines had 166 million passengers in 2019. To say that they're struggling is an understatement. They're doing very, very well. Of course, it's split almost equally between WestJet and Air Canada. The comment made earlier that yes, we allowed WestJet to buy Sunwing. Well, you know, that boosted those 166 million passengers into just two airlines. So we have a major issue with that. Mr. Moore, Professor Moore, you talked about that the demand is there, and the demand may not be there, or the demand is there for airlines. But I think I wanted to talk about the focus on that the barriers are high, it seems, for new airlines to come in. And what I want to specifically focus on is competition, and what are the rules we need to change in competition in Canada to enforce more competition. And the example I give right now is that if you were going to buy a round-trip flight between Toronto and Ottawa, I think next week, and an off-peak time, it's about $585. But if you're going to buy a round-trip flight right now between Toronto and Vancouver, it's only $385. The difference being that Flair Airlines, trying to compete, is in the Toronto-Vancouver market. We have Porter between Toronto and Ottawa, but you can see the difference. What do we need to do to ensure there's more competition and barriers are lower for any airline that wants to compete against the duopoly in Canada?
Well, it'd be great to have some ultra low cost carriers. And ultra low cost carriers, I've sat down with Scully Morganson, who lived in Montreal, who found WOW Air, the founding CEO of Southwest, and talked to a bunch of CEOs about this. You think differently. It's all about costs. And you really, really focus. And this is one of the three basic strategies of Michael Porter at Harvard: low cost. We think of going to Walmart. We think of going to Costco. That there's a mindset which is different when you go to the Ritz-Carlton or you go to Holt Renfrew. It's a different world you're in. And in airlines, ultra-low cost carriers really focus on that. But the problem is the high taxes, the high other fees in Canada make it the difference between you and a fuller carrier like Air Canada or WestJet is much less in terms of the price difference. So you're not rewarded for that ultra low cost focus that they know how to do. So that would help it encourage those competitors come in and use their approach. And it's interesting that one of the things they do is ask for, oh, you want water? I remember asking for that in Iceland Air, and they said $5. They thought it was a human right. They said, it is, but it's $5. So but Air Canada, WestJet are going after charging you for your seat. Oh, you want a bag? Oh, that'll be this much, and so on. Oh, you wanted a meal. So you are old enough to remember when you used to get meals and all that. So we're adjusting that, but I think ultra low cost carrier is a good solution.
I don't know that, yeah, but
I apologize.
I understand.
And for an older man, it's totally inappropriate. I apologize.
No, I am old enough, I believe. But you know, the big thing is you have competitors. So we have Porter Airlines, right? They expanded their Canadian success story. I think you mentioned earlier, WestJet had these 6 panels of airlines that went bankrupt. Porter has fought tooth and nail to keep on that island and to fight their way out. They have 36 jets and they're trying to compete. Porter, I'm old enough to remember when Porter was giving you a beer for free on the way to Thunder Bay. And, you know, it was a service that Air Canada and WestJet weren't doing. But there's barriers, and we're going to hear from those airlines, to expanding and getting into east side of Canada and going there. What is the government's role? How have they got it wrong? And how does the government get out of the way a bit so a Porter can expand? Or do we need to, the other side, you know, look at open skies or cabotage to bring more competitors into markets where we don't have choice? The idea being we want choice for Canadians in every market across Canada when we have 166 million passengers on airlines. How do we do that?
30-second response, please.
Where it's 49%, but you can only you can't own all 49% as a foreigner, which makes it much less attractive to invest in the airline industry in Canada for those rich foreigners. I'm not sure we have a lot of rich Canadians that want to get rid of their wealth through owning an airline, but we have a lot of rich foreigners that see opportunities if there's some changes to the rules in Canada, that there would be greater investment. So I think that let's keep the 49% rule so that we Canadians are in charge, but allow one organization to have the full 49% would be, I think, an interesting and helpful change potentially.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Moore, and thank you, Mr. Williams. Prochainement, next we have Ms. Koutrakis. The floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before our committee today. Mr. Gredig, I'm going to start with you. You've written about junk fees that tend to form a significant part of Discount Airlines revenues. Can you speak to what junk fees are and how they impact competition between large and smaller air carriers? And how do these fees impact consumers?
I didn't invent the term junk fees. I'll just leave that to other pundits to claim ownership. But when we talk about junk fees, it's characterized really as fees that are over and above whatever you pay as your base fare in an airline context. So you pay for seat selection, you pay for a carry-on bag, you pay for check bag fees. People have considered those as junk fees, and they've been around a long time. They haven't been around just weeks or months or even years. They've been around for decades. Airlines have used them traditionally to create what we have traditionally called as fences to make sure that people, in fact, when you buy a fare, you understand that there are conditions associated with that fare, that if you want to change your fare, change your itinerary, change your dates of travel, it's going to cost you something. And that cost has now had that moniker of junk fee associated to it. But they've been around a long time. What's happened now is the proliferation of these junk fees and the number of these so-called junk fees that are around there. And that's really been the moniker for low-cost carriers looking to improve their financial performance by what I would call chunking out the services that they would normally build for passengers. So now you're paying X number of dollars for your first check bag, X plus dollars for your second check bag. You're paying, you want a seat, on a window, you want a seat in the aisle, you want a seat with more leg room. Those are all charges that have now become part of the modus operandi of ULCCs. So when a customer buys an airfare between Toronto and Vancouver on Flair Airlines, you see a ticket price and it's X, whatever the dollars happen to be. Now, when you made the booking and they're offering you, the actual price of that, they try to sell you up. They sell you up with a bunch of other conditions: bags, check bags, carry-on baggage, seat selection, meals, all kinds of amenities that they want to throw at you. And so those are the fees that sometimes the actual dollars you pay as a customer for that trip on a carrier such as Flair can be significant. In fact, Flair has admitted that over 40% of their revenues is based on their junk fees that they're out there in the marketplace. So junk fees are an important part of the business. They will not go away. And my bet is that there'll continue to be a proliferation of these fees into the future.
Thank you very much. And Professor Moore, economies of scale must be critical to airline survival in the long run, unless they offer something truly unique, like a niche market. Larger networks are typically more efficient and offer more travel options to passengers. Keeping that in mind, and from your perspective, what are the factors that make the smaller airlines more vulnerable in Canada and elsewhere? And is it the same situation in countries across the globe?
I think I'll defer to some of my colleagues who would know more about that and put them on the spot.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Carl. Much appreciate that. Yeah, it's when you talk about, the proliferation of these carriers and how these carriers operate. Their carriers tend to have a certain life in Canada that unfortunately is short. And in the U.S., Spirit, Allegiant, Frontier been around a number of years, as has Southwest. So, the modus operandi for a low-cost carrier in a given aviation industry or in aviation environment is such that when you talk about, can we in fact learn from those countries in terms of how they operate versus how we operate ULCCs in Canada? The answer, of course, is yes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, you have the mic. All right. There seems to be a consensus among the witnesses in terms of the burden of costs and fees that come with an airline ticket. But so that leads me to another question. Somebody who takes a flight is going to pay the costs of that flight. But in other models, there's we subsidize some of those costs. So we subsidize, people that are going on leisure trips, they're going to the beach or going to see the Eiffel Tower or the Tower of Pisa. But do you find that that's the model that we should be looking to adopt? Some people may be more privileged than others. They have the means to travel. Should they be getting funded by all Canadians, or is there a way of going about this so that we can reduce those fees without falling into subsidization? Thank you. Mr. Roy, please. Well, I'm not against the idea that users pay. Air transportation is a very costly form of transportation, especially if it's going to, to go get a tan on the beach. But I would distinguish between people who are living in like Sept-Îles or Magdalen Islands or Baie-Comeau who need air transportation. It's an essential service for them for personal, medical reasons and others. And I think the Canadian government should look at that issue. So there are city pairs that are poorly served. Air Canada might be the only carrier, or it might have withdrawn from that market altogether. So, and there's simply no replacement. And when there are, those companies are vulnerable. So I think it would be timely for the Canadian government to examine this question and to look at what's done elsewhere in the United States and Europe, but because the market is not operating properly. No one else wants to comment on that? Okay. If I can, I would like to step in. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Ibrahimi. So I agree with what my colleagues just said, but I would add that the idea of a payment per use, we'd have to look at that in very broad terms, but we also need to consider that air transportation is a structuring industry. And what I mean by that is that when we invest in that sector, there are 2 or 3 other dollars that come back to the economy. So, it's not just people going to beaches, there's a whole range of activities. Airports are important places. So we have to look at it in that kind of broader way. So the principle of user pay means that, citizens who are entitled to take the plane can't take the plane. So we're in a democratic company. So those who can so what we're saying is that people who can't afford to travel shouldn't travel, and those who can afford should travel. So, and that's not acceptable. But we can improve the situation. There are things that we have control over, and that we can look at so that the people who choose or want to take the plane can do so. So, and it's the kind of the chicken and the hen, or the hen and the egg argument. So, I mean, offer depends on the demand, and demand depends on offer. So, but there's the regional issue. Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Waugh was talking about essential travel from smaller regional markets, and this is a topic that's very germane in the region that I represent, where most of our airports are only served by Air Canada. And we have a huge price discrepancy when it comes to flying out of different centers. So, from two communities, from Smithers and Prince Rupert, flying to Vancouver, you can pay as much as twice as much on Air Canada as you do flying from Terrace to to Vancouver. And the only difference is that the Terrace market has WestJet service as well. And so Air Canada competes with WestJet, and as a result, the prices are far lower. But in smaller communities, you're not going to see, there isn't room in the market for two carriers. So I'm wondering what the policy options are, whether a public subsidy like the one that Quebec has put in place is the only option, or whether there are other policy measures that can ensure relatively affordable and fair air travel between these smaller communities and larger centers. And maybe I'll ask that to Mr. Watt, since you were just talking about it. Sorry.
OK, je peux prendre la question.
I can answer that, maybe. So I think there are two ways of acting. So in Quebec, we subsidize travelers by offering them discounts, but it's also important to look at the service offer. Is the current service offer satisfactory? Could you go do a, if you go in, if you have medical needs or you need to go and see your family, can you do those trips? Are the rates acceptable? And that requires work. We really have to analyze those markets and then decide, do we accept the situation or do we intervene? And to intervene, you have to, you kind of have to get away from this idea that competition will solve everything. I've been studying this regional transportation for 20 years, and we always come to the same problems and the same questions. So maybe the federal government should adopt a certain form of intervention. I'm not talking about regulation, but look at what's being done elsewhere to allow Canadian travelers to have acceptable service levels.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Professor Moore, I just wanted to follow up on your comments about secondary airports as a potential venue for or avenue for reduced fares for Canadians, because Hamilton International Airport is actually in my constituency, and it's obviously an example where you've got a proximity to a population of arguably 5-6 million people within an hour's drive, if not more. In fact, it was the WestJet Eastern hub for a while till they moved to Toronto. And so you talked about the decline of secondary airports. Do you see, as we get further distance from the pandemic, perhaps a rebound in the use of secondary airports? And what is the government doing that's hindering that? Or what can they do to improve that situation?
The airport managers go out there and they use data from IATA to figure out, listen, they're like, Montreal is growing a lot. Partly because they said, look, if people are flying to Toronto, then on to Rome, let's just have a Montreal-Rome flight. And you show the data and you go, that makes sense. And you go to Air Canada, Alitalia, and say, here's the data. You should offer these flights. So there's a place for outstanding airport managers like that to go out there with their people and sell what they have to the airlines and get them to service them. And again, you could get forward like to Europe and the US, you have more options than just within Canada. So I think there's a role there for those people to do that. But it's also, if you want to go for low cost, which is secondary airports tend to be lower cost, so it's a model, low cost carrier that likes that model, then you got to make the rest of the model work as well. And that gets back to the fees issue, that you can't just remove a little bit of the cost, but it's substantial, so they can really say instead of $1,000, it's $500, and we could still make money at it. It helps to be in at a Hamilton as opposed to Pearson for a number of reasons. That can be given forward, but I think there's a role there for reducing the fees as well. So the low cost, the ultra low cost model is more attractive and is doable in its business and as a business.
Had a similar experience as your friend did in Abbotsford, where you're going through Hamilton, where it's a smaller lineup. Let me ask a question, Mr. Graddick. You've been before this committee a number of times, I believe. But I recall once in November of 2022, and I don't expect you to remember exactly the context, but we were having a discussion about coming out of the pandemic, problems at airports, and you referenced the European Union model as one where their regulatory regime was more efficient than what we have in Canada. So I'm wondering if you could expand upon that in the context of this study here.
Yeah, I think that, when you talk about the regulatory regimes in which airports and airlines and the rest of the aviation community work in, I think that, you want to make sure that you're looking into a regime that removes as many operational and financial constraints as possible to ensure that you're giving the airlines and the airports a chance to survive. I think we talked a bit about the taxes this morning. And that's a significant one. It's a level playing field. Everybody plays it, but that's the price you have to pay to play in this game in Canada. I think that what you want to basically look at doing is really trying to understand, the overall government policy of how do we work as an integrated system across all of these components: airplanes, airlines, airports, CATSA, NAVCAN. All of those players have got to work together. And unfortunately, in Canada, we still seem to have a situation where data that we need in order for us to really make effective decisions around how the business operates is still not being shared properly. The Europeans, the Americans have done an exceptional job in terms of making sure that the players have the means to share data, future data, in terms of what their plans are growing and how things are growing. Right now, we're having a problem in Canada getting all of these players to kind of share data that makes the job a lot easier in planning what this business looks like. Montreal Airports is going through a $4.5 billion expansion. Pearson is going to go through X billion dollars worth of expansion. Unfortunately, I'm not sure whether all of the cards are on the table from some of the other players to make sure they're making the right decisions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. Just on time, 4 minutes, 58 seconds. Wonderful. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to go with Mr. Gradick with respect to my questioning. I would like to get a bit more granular on the business side of and how to make this happen with respect to a more healthy environment for our airline sector. And I'll preface my comments by saying this, having spent many years in business, that although subsidies are always, a go-to for government as well as others to take advantage of, what's more important in the business world is to have, and I think Mr. Gradick touched on it, better and more strategic policy in place by government to allow for better decision-making within the private sector. Canada is a big area, small population, and therefore what I'm going to concentrate on, Mr. Gradick, is integrating our supply networks. We look at fluidity with respect to moving people and trade. We looked at, based on that fluidity, having more cost efficiency built into the system. And of course, a lot of that depends on the policies that are put in place by government. The operational and capital side, sustainability, by not isolating the movement of goods and or people, but actually integrating the movement of goods and people. Therefore, integrating our supply chains, integrating our networks, as well as recognizing where those regional hubs are, where those markets are, and the strengths of which, as well as, again, supply chains, people and goods, logistics, integrating supply networks, and of course, with that, finally, the integration of a multimodal network that exists in Canada, but has never been taken fully advantage of when it comes to that integration, and therefore, once again, the fluidity and the cost efficiency. So with all that said, Mr. Gradick, I want to give you the opportunity, based on your experience, on how to bring all that together, and of course, then have the proper policy put in place by government to allow for a more robust airline network.
You're touching something that's been close to my heart for the last couple of years, following up the national supply chain policy papers and the view about, what's wrong with our supply chains in Canada, and of which airports are an integral part of that supply chain. And I think that one of the things that we have seen is that, we keep pointing the finger at the government for lack of integrating capability across all of the different players that are out there. The world of supply chain has changed significantly, and it's going to change even more. We're going to move into very much a digital world. We're going to be moving into a world in which, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, data is going to be the important driver of decision-making, of efficiency in our supply chains. So I am a wholehearted supporter of the need for us to have an integrated view of how stuff moves across this country and making sure we're using the right mode of transportation to move stuff from point A to point B. Our international partners depend on it. Our economy, our export economy depends on it. And if we don't do it, we're going to be, playing second fiddle to numbers of international organizations that have done a better job of integrating. So yes, there is a need. How that need gets expressed and how do we do it? The National Supply Chain Officer, interesting concept, but yeah, it's just something that's more of a Band-Aid at this point in time. We need some effective processes in place that industries can, adhere to, and that we can measure how well we're doing as compared to what our competitors are doing, and are we moving the needle in terms of improving our efficiency and our effectiveness when it comes to supply chain network management. We haven't done those yet.
Thank you, Mr. Gredick. And what I'm getting out of those comments is that the expectation to go to the supply chain office and do two things. One is when they are bringing forward their supply chain logistics strategy, that includes not just the movement of goods, but also the movement of people.
Correct.
Both of which on the capital side, with respect to strategic investments, for example, the HFR, high frequency rail, which is now going to separate moving people and goods on two separate pieces of infrastructure, and therefore creating more fluidity and more possibility for that integration between different modes of transportation. I guess the next question, Mr. Gredick, is with respect to the need to be focused also, especially with air, not only on domestic travel, but also binational travel with our American partners, as well as international travel. And of course, going back to our comments and our thoughts about the integration of a multimodal network, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that when we talk about the way in which we, in fact, operate across borders is key. The conversations that I've had with our U.S. transportation officials is that they are keen to looking at somehow, some way, harmonizing the practices across our border. They know that we are in a state of flux in terms of what the Canadian government's policies are. I think it's time for us to make sure that we've got at least an integrated North American strategy that deals with, the supply chain issues that we all know exist. So I think that, there is an opportunity. We shouldn't be wasting it. But the clock is ticking, that we've got to make sure that we've got policies in place that in fact promote effective and very efficient supply chain network policies across the borders, at least.
Thank you, Mr. Gredick, and I do want to say to you, I appreciate your comments. This is in fact something that's near and dear to my heart as well in our discussions with our American colleagues over in Washington, to not only look at strategic policy that we can harmonize, but also strategic investments from the capital side to integrate better our transportation system. So I thank you for that validation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Next, we have Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to get into a bit of the differences in taxes and fees between Canadian fares and American fares, because we do have competition in my neck of the woods in British Columbia. I live in Chilliwack, which is about a half an hour from the Abbotsford Airport and about 45 minutes or an hour tops to the Bellingham Airport. And we have seen some analysis says the flight price in Canada includes 43% in taxes compared to 15% in the U.S. And talking about airport rents, that the federal government has collected for 2022-23, $419 million in airport rents, an increase of 42.5% in just 10 years. We talked about as of May 1st, so tomorrow, travelers in Canada will pay $9.94 for a domestic flight and $34.42 for an international flight on security fees. The same fee in the United States is less than $15.30. So maybe I'll go to Professor Moore, who referenced the Abbotsford Airport, which is the closest international airport to me. Do you think that the federal government cares that millions of Canadians every year are choosing to fly out of Bellingham, SeaTac, Billings, Great Falls, Buffalo? They're making the choice that Canadian air travel is unaffordable. And if you're taking a family of four to Disneyland for maybe a once-in-a-lifetime trip, or you're doing that recreational travel, I can tell you that all of my constituents who do that travel are not just examining, WestJet and Air Canada. They're examining Vancouver International Airport versus Seattle Tacoma. So can you talk about the fact that we are losing? Is it quantified? Does the government monitor that? And do you think they particularly care if Canadians fly out of U.S. markets instead of Canadian ones?
It's not difficult to monitor. If you go down to Plattsburgh, and it's an hour and a quarter from Montreal, I went down to do a PBS interview, so I know it's an hour and a quarter. I did it last week. And the sign at Plattsburgh is Montreal's U.S. airport. Like, they're not subtle about it. Because, and PBS is interested in Montreal because there's 4 million people, 1 million of them Anglophones, versus upstate New York. So they know where the market is. And at one level, if Canadians can go down and going to Plattsburgh, it's not as fast to go to Plattsburgh, but if you live in the South Shore of Montreal, it's almost as fast to go to Plattsburgh if you have Nexus than to go to Pearson on a certain day. That's overstating it, but not Pearson, Trudeau, sorry. Should have my airport strict there. But it's something where, and you see the same, that my brother who lives in Abbotsford will go down to the U.S. to save money. At one level, that's helping Canadians. So we like that. And it's providing jobs in the U.S., not Canada. But the government is aware of that, but it's chosen a certain approach, which helps a lot of Canadians' families. And I would say the majority, I'm to remember geography class, the majority of Canadians live within a short distance of the U.S. And think of Montreal. When I lived in Toronto, you'd go down to Buffalo. It's a little bit further. But if you live in Hamilton or Niagara Falls, flying out of Buffalo is not difficult to do, and I've done it. So Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver all have our biggest cities. Now, Edmonton, it's more of a challenge, I agree. It's a long drive. But it's something where a lot of Canadians benefit from it. The government is aware of it. They've chosen that path. And I can't entirely disagree that Canadians get a good bargain out of it.
Right. Do you think we've talked a bit here about the user pay model, which some of the panelists have gotten behind, said that the user should pay, certainly when it comes to recreational travel. We've just done a study on HFR, high frequency rail, where the analysis is that the government should pay for all of the infrastructure and subsidize the travel for a portion of the population that does not include any Western Canadians, for instance. So do you think that there is there a logical discrepancy between, I would argue that air travel is more accessible to more Canadians than high frequency rail will ever be. So why do you think there is such a difference of approaches where the government is saying, if you're flying, you pay the full freight. If you're taking a train, we'll subsidize you to the tune of hundreds of dollars per passenger?
30 seconds, please.
Element of it as well. Very clearly, where in France, if you have trains that go there with, I believe it's 2 hours, you can't fly. So there's an environmental aspect of it, which is really taken on board around the world. And we think about, but we can look at the U.S., parts of the U.S., but Europe and so on, where they have great trains. And I think we're rightly jealous. But you're right, it's Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, particularly maybe Edmonton and Calgary, but it's limited in northern BC, for example, for our friend Taylor here. It's just not going to happen in our lifetime.
Thank you very much.
I'm older. Sorry, again, that was an old person comment. So my lifetime is shorter than your lifetime, sir.
So maybe. Thank you very much, Professor Moore, and thank you, Mr. Stroll. Next, we have Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. So this is a very interesting discussion. It's not like there's a silver bullet answer here. The idea of user pay versus government subsidized seems very complex. But one question I have is that if there were to be subsidies for remote and necessary travel, that at this point, and the Île-de-la-Madeleine was given as an example, what would be the logical order of government to subsidize that travel? Would it necessarily be federal, even if it's a federally regulated air travel, or would it be more logically provincial, territorial, or even local? So anybody that wants to weigh in on that, I'm interested.
I'll try. I'll jump in on that one to start with, and we'll start the ball rolling. Sorry, Carl. But I think that one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the way in which we look at services in Canada, if there's one part of the population in Canada that really is, getting the short end of the stick when it comes to air services, it's the North. The North has been served by carriers that are subsidized by various levels of provincial government over the years. And the First Nations themselves are subsidizing some of that traffic, but it is very expensive to fly in Northern Canada. And we need specialized pieces of equipment, specialized pilots to fly in that part of the world. So if we consider that we need to invest in the future of our country, and the North is very much a part of this country, I would say that the backstop should be the federal government. The first level of support should come from the provincial government. They know best. They know the communities that need it. They're supporting the infrastructure in those communities. That there should be decisions made based on provincial government needs, but there should be a corresponding backstop by the federal government when it comes to funding required to support those services.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So in thinking about this project of pulling all the players together to address systemic challenges, and correlating that with the national supply chain integration discussions. So even though I heard that there isn't a model for our air travel experience and costs, given Canada's unique factors, there isn't a model we could say do it like they're doing it there. But is there a model for the complicated initiative of pulling all the players together to smooth out the system? Is there some jurisdiction that's done that so we don't have to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, there are. I think that, our friends in the northern Scandinavian countries have done a pretty good job of looking at trying to coordinate among the different levels of government, the level of aviation support in those communities. So if you really want to have a look at how they've done it, it's an interesting model. Would it be applicable in Canada? I don't know, but there are, of course, learnings. Let's understand how they've done it, understand that they've gone through some trials and tribulations in getting their model right. Is it the perfect model? Of course not. But is it better than Canada? I don't know. I haven't drilled down to the point, but it does work. There are services provided in the northern part of the Scandinavian countries that have a certain level of funding from either the state or from the regional governments, and it does work. So, yet there's some learnings there, but I think that we shouldn't shy away from taking on the initiative in Canada to really try to develop a Canadian solution. That we've been around this business a long time. We've been flying to the north for years, for decades. we know what some of the issues are, and we know what it's going to take to make these things work. We just have, a lack of, I don't know, lack of will, or a lack of direction, or a lack of, I would say, intestinal fortitude, for lack of a better word, to basically make something happen. And I think, the North, has been waiting. The North is waiting, and we need to be able to get off our collective butts and basically get the North to basically operate in a way that makes it a lot more effective than it is today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gredick, and thank you, Ms. Murray. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Now we have Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like where we're going when it talks to regional air transport, where possibly I think there would be a consensus here that when we all agree that the user pay model is really a failure in regions. So if we had to review this particular model, how should it be reviewed? What are the fees that should be taken on in a different manner? Maybe Mr. Ebrahimi has some ideas. This is a subject I've been working on for several years, and I will approve what my colleague John said here. The issue with this model is that we think that the air transport is like the final objective for development of region, but we have to inverse this like they did in a Scandinavian country. In Scandinavian country, they said, okay, you know what? Air transport is just a means. We must find a way for region to develop, whether it's an economic area or for tourism. And then when we develop this at the regional level with local actors, then the request, the demand happens. We have beautiful regions in Quebec, for example, but the touristic infrastructure is not there. If you're going to a regional airport, there is no hotel, no car rentals, none of those things, which means that the touristic attraction is not exploited to its full potential. For example, I will look to Denmark. Even in the further north, there are small airports that have been created that are designed for the local economic activity. In the case of Norway, there are airports with industrial zone with the collaboration of all the local actors. We invited the local business to basically focus around an airport, which means that the airport activities have been increased. So it is like a stimulation of the economic activity, which means that business people can go there easily. So it creates a demand. And once the demand is created, whether it is for tourism or industry, we see that the companies came, they settled there. There's been projects that emerged, and they have become permanent. It is with this kind of formulation that we think about it. If you establish the line, it's going to develop. No, it's not the case. Thank you, Mr. Ebrahima. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
I'd like to take another crack at this question around rural airports and smaller regional centers. And Mr. Moore noted that most of the Canadian population lives within a few kilometers of the U.S. border, and we live a short distance from the U.S. border too. It's just the other U.S. border in Southeast Alaska. And really the issue, I think a lot of people feel like the big airline is gouging consumers. Basically, there's zero competition, and they're able to charge whatever they feel people will be willing to pay. And when it's essential travel, people have to get to a larger center, say for a medical appointment, they're willing to pay whatever it takes to get there. What, short of doing what Quebec's done and maybe some other jurisdictions where they subsidize the cost of those flights, what other policy options are available to government to ensure that airlines are charging a fair price? I think everyone accepts that there are costs to running an airline and that a company like Air Canada deserves to make a profit, but it feels like what's being paid in some cases is exorbitant. Are there any other policy options that can ensure fairness for consumers? And maybe I'll start with Mr. Moore, since he's right here beside me, and then if I have time and the chair allows, I'll turn to other witnesses.
I just came back from Morocco, and one thing that struck us is the government's role in creating clusters and creating. So they created a hub, which we stayed at, to bring families to very nice hotels. So they created that, and they're bringing flights there. So they're creating a reason to be there, whether it be tourism, you have a beautiful part of the country in, or it's because of its mining, as we see in Labrador City, been up there to visit the mine. There's that sense of there's some reason to go there, means there'll be greater volumes, and you're more apt to get to better number of flights and better prices. So that's, I think, a medium to long-term policy we should think about. What is it that would take people to parts of remote Quebec, which I'm from, and it's enormously beautiful there? Let's build that infrastructure, someone pointed out. So that's one thing, but I think there's other things as well that we could do beyond that. But that's a medium to long-term thing that I just saw in Morocco and really comes to mind as something we would think about, which we're doing some, but we could do more.
Mr. Graddick, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I do. So, I've been around this business, as I mentioned, a few decades, and, I remember the days of regulation, and I remember the days of price control, and I remember the days in which we established a direct relationship between the cost of flying passengers from point A to point B and the price you charge passengers from point A to point B. And there really was, in the days, transport or the CTA or its precursors basically validated any attempt by the carrier to raise its prices over and above the cost of doing business. And so we got away from the regulatory model because we felt let the market decide how best to behave, how airlines should behave from a pricing perspective, and let the market decide how should prices work. And so we've let in my opinion, we've let the marketplace kind of evolve over the last 50 years and saying, what's the relationship between price and cost? Can't find it. It's basically price is what the market will bear, as you mentioned. And so, you're paying big bucks coming out of non-competitive markets. And I think that's where, how do we fix it? Can we fix it? Should we fix it? And
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Williams once again. The floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Moore, you started when you were giving your intro talking about how this is a problem that is the government's fault. Sure, and I'd like you to expand on that a little bit if you could. Just what regulations, what problems are the government's creating rather than solving?
Well, the sheer number of fees, the amount they add to tickets in Canada, airport fees, things like that, which in most jurisdictions are funded by the government rather than funded by the flying public. And there's a certain logic to say, let the people fly, do it. But it's such an important part of our economy, not just to travelers, but business travel is very important to getting business done here and abroad. You got to go see a customer sometimes. That airports are really strong economic drivers. We see this in Hamilton. Very, very helpful when you have an airport that works well, that is not irritating to go through. So Pearson and Trudeau are both spending a lot of money to make it a better experience.
So on that note, do you believe that government policies have left airports inadequately capitalized and that they're creating service levels and constraints?
Yes. But let me turn to my colleagues to modify that and qualify it, as I'm sure they're apt to as good academics.
Yeah, the question becomes one of, do you let the system decide on its own what they think is best for them? And right now, in the current governance model that we have for our airports, the independent authorities that run these airports decide by themselves, what's good and what's not good for them. There's no oversight. They spend money, based on what they think is important. So Trudeau Airports decided that $4 billion is needed to fix road access to the airport, to spend money, on parking. But what are they doing about air access? What are they doing about gates? What are they doing about the terminal building? They've decided on their own that their priorities are road access and parking. Best use of money? I don't know.
And so, in other words, we don't have targets, and we're not measuring those targets when it comes to competition. And then those airports obviously are not going to put competition first. I guess a good question along those lines is, what should we be doing to create competition through the airport side? And that could be real estate. Example, I got off a flight and it was all we call the Air Canada Alley. It was just owned, it seemed, entirely by Air Canada. Real estate seems to be an issue too. So how do we in airports, or how do we entice airports to create competition through the gates in terms of having priorities on competition? How does that work? Let's start with Dr. Moore.
Oh, Carl's fine. So it's something where there is a fair bit of competition there. When you look at food, it really has improved a lot in the big airports in Canada, much better than it used to be. So there are some improvements that have happened over time, I would say, but it's still, there's room for more competition for sure. But to some degree, Trudeau may compete with Plattsburgh, but it doesn't compete that much with Pearson other than on some international flights, which has improved over the last 5 or 10 years. That there's more flights going from Montreal than there used to be. So you don't compete with Pearson too much, in my experience anyway.
I think that one of the things that we're seeing at Trudeau Airport, and we're seeing at Pearson as well, is that the decisions that are being made in the investments being made in the airports really are what they don't really understand, the impact of those investments on the whole of air transport and travel through the airport. Montreal is going to be a mess for the next 2-3 years as they go through this parking and road access process of investment. And what are they doing about improving the connectivity of passengers inside that building? Nothing.
So I would also talk about, NAV Canada's budgetary structure, factoring into the level of fees facing both Canadian Airlines and air travelers. Could moving NAV Canada into the Department of Transport's funding umbrella, like the FAA and the United States, potentially reduce airport fees?
Well, they could. I think that NavCan, in terms of its investment profile and the way it's been managing its own fate over the last few years, has been exemplary. I think that they are considered one of the better run nav centers around the world. I think that one of the things that's happening, in the U.S. is that there's been a lack of investment in the U.S. navigation systems, and it's coming home to roost. That the FAA is finding it's got some issues about navigation that's forcing it to have a different governance structure. I'm not sure we have that same issue here in Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Finally, for today, we have Mr. Iachino. Mr. Iachino, la parole est à vous. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have the floor. You have 5 minutes. And thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think what is really important is I hear quite often across that it's the fault of the government. It's always the fault of the government. Of course, it's easy to say it's our fault. It's our fault, the government. But airports have been in existence for a very long time. It's only since 2015 that they've existed. So if there is a mechanism that is in place right now, it's because it's always been there. So our government has invested a lot in airports. And I think that what needs to be said here is that the government of Canada does not control all the airlines. The government of Canada has an impact, certainly has something to say about airports and the functioning of the airports. But I have never heard that the government of Canada had a direct control on all airlines. So it must be said that airlines, they have their word to say and they have their way of doing things. And at the end of the line, we have to find some kind of collaboration between those actors. So I think it is important to say it is not exclusively the fault of the government of Canada. I think it is the fault of everybody that there is no collaboration. And at the end of the day,
that's what it's all about. But there's a problem, making money, but what about the service? So that's where the government of Canada steps in, because the service is being penalized because everybody's out there to make money, and the service is getting worse and worse. So, j'irai avec mes questions à Dr.
So I'm going to go with my questions to Dr. Ebrahimi. I'm sorry, Ebrahimi. could you explain to the committee the difference between the management of the management of supply and the price of airline tickets? Thank you very much. I hear you. The issue is not that it is the fault of the government. You are right. The problem is endemic. It's been existing for many, many years. And my colleague John give you a brief history of all that issue. It is not a problem exclusively because of the government of Canada. Do you agree with me? Governments of Canada, for at least the last 3 decades, have not played the role that they could have played in order to improve the situation. And this I can say. So why am I saying such a thing? It's first because you just have to look. Of course, everybody wants to make money. But look, Lufthansa makes money, and German airports are well managed. They generate profits, and accessibility is very good. Paris Airport makes money. Air France makes money. So accessibility is also good. The problem is that here, because of the mode of governance of our various airports, we find ourselves in situations where everybody does whatever they want. There isn't really some kind of coherence. Nothing prevents the federal government from saying, okay, Trudeau and Pearson Airport, you chose to spend more than 4.5 billion here in Montreal and something like 10 billion in Pearson. So in those extra slots that you're creating, we are going to give it to companies. We're going to keep these slots to companies which will generate competition. Nothing prevents you from saying, if you have international flights that are very good, you also have the obligation to maintain regional flights. We can do this. This is the federal jurisdiction. This can be done. But this being said, we're not trying to be into a dictatorship and have some kind of, planned economy. But with the various actors, we can certainly find compromises. We can find proper profits. So it's been over 10 years that the program of reducing airfares has been in place in Quebec. So are there lessons that we can learn from this plan, and what are those lessons? The various programs that the Quebec has put in place, even with all the goodwill, it has not helped with the region. Every time we put in money, it would solve the problem for a little while. For example, the government of Quebec gave $500 per ticket, but at the end of the day, it was a failure. Why? Again, it is because this idea that for air transport to play a role, there has to be a demand. And for this, you must have economic activities that are essential. Did this program have an impact on the quality of service? Not really. Not really. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Iacono.
I'd like to ask one question to the witnesses. Seeing none. Thank you, colleagues. The question that I have is for all 3 of the witnesses that are still with us. And the question is, we have a model in Canada, which is more of the pay-as-you-go model. In the United States, they tend to spend more federally invested in reducing the cost or the taxes necessary on the price of tickets. The question that I have is, assuming we put forward an argument that it would be in our best interest to take off some of the taxes that are currently on plane tickets. We had Mr. Rogers speak to the taxes that are added on. We've had several of our witnesses speak to the taxes that are added on. You yourself had referenced the fact that your starting price is this, and when you're done, it reaches this. Assuming we were to remove all of that and absorb those costs as the government, making it a government expense, right? What would stop the companies, Air Canada, for example, saying Canadians are paying $1,000 for this exact ticket price right now. Federal government, by removing all those fees, are absorbing $300 in the taxes, making it $700. What is to stop those companies from raising that price to $1,000 and then basically making it the same price for Canadian consumers, but the money going into the pockets of the companies and then taxpayers paying for that amount? Does anybody want to perhaps comment on that?
Welcome to open competition. Welcome to open competition. You know, that's the price we pay. Unless you walk in there and start talking about controls, the market will in fact decide the pricing structure that's going to be in place. And there's nothing preventing the airlines.
Just to be clear, there is a possibility that the companies could just raise their prices to compensate for that, and consumers ended up paying the same amount. And in fact, they're paying more because they're paying through their taxes. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I appreciate your the ability to allow me to ask that question. I have one last housekeeping note, and I've spoken to most of you about this. We have to adopt the budget for this study. It was circulated on Friday. Do we have any objections? Do I have unanimous consent to adopt the budget for the study? Seeing no objection, so adopted. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being with us today and for lending their expertise to this very important study. I will now adjourn the meeting.